Church, Sarah Fredericks, she's a college student, she put that together, so I think she did a really great job with that video. That's really neat. That's what I would say. Well done, well done. And I'm wearing my Norwegian sweater because right before I got here, or I left the house, did anyone see the Norwegian skier who won like a record number of medals right this afternoon? Wasn't that cool? Oh my goodness. Yeah, let's clap for Norway, right? Right there, right. Yeah, sure, you betcha, right? There are times in life where we have to go through things that are hard to get to something better. There are times in life where we have to sort of grin and bear it. We have to kind of put our head down and hunker down. We got to do things that are kind of a drag to get to something that is a whole lot better. For example, have any of you started your taxes yet? Right? Some of you are going, I saw the look on your face like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. Huh? Right? You got to get your taxes done. You got to do your taxes, and hopefully just maybe there'll be a tax return at the end, right? If you're here on Wednesday, I talked about how for me, spring is one of those things you have to get through to get to summer. For me, if I could, I would skip over spring and go right to summer. Anybody else with me? Right? I would skip over spring because spring is this time where your car constantly needs to be washed. The dog is constantly covered in mud. The kids are dragging mud through the house. The snow melts in the yard, and there's all that garbage that blew over. You can now see all over your yard that blew over during the first snowstorm from your neighbor's yard. Right? If it were up to me, I would skip spring and go right to summer. But you got to go through spring to get to summer, right? There are things you have to just go through. How many of you enjoy the process of buying a new car, right? Anybody? Nobody enjoys that. Nobody likes to deal with car salesmen. I'm sorry if any of you are car salesmen, but it's not a fun experience, right? Nobody likes to move, right? Nobody likes the process of packing and downsizing, but it gets you to something really great. Sometimes we have to go through things that are really hard and difficult to get us to a better place. I was talking about this with my wife, and my wife said, well, that's kind of like childbirth, right? And I'm not an authority on this, but from the screams and the animal grunts from my wife the day my kids were born, I'm going to take her word for it. You have to go through labor to get you to this thing that's absolutely wonderful. It's transforming, right? You have to go through something really hard to get you to this place where life before is never the same. Sometimes you have to go through things that are really hard to get you to something that's a whole lot better. Well, as we journey towards Easter, just like you have to go through spring to get to summer, and you have to go through labor in order to have that child placed in your hand, Jesus had to go through the cross. Jesus had to go through the cross to get to the empty tomb. Jesus had to go through the cross to get to the empty tomb. And as we journey towards Easter, we have to go also through the cross in order to get to Easter as well. This cross up here was made by a couple of members of our church, Liz and Aaron Paul, and it's really pretty cool. It's really big too, yeah. But it's going to be up during the season of Lent, the whole entire time, as sort of a focal point for us as we think about the cross during this time between now and Easter, this time called Lent. Because the cross is one of these things that I think for most of us, we have sort of this strange relationship to. Many of us wear crosses around our necks. We hang them in every church, there's a cross hanging on the wall. I'm sure most of you have a cross somewhere in your house. It's the most popular tattoo in the world, it's a cross. And yet it seems like we all have sort of a little bit of an aversion to the story of the cross. Sort of like when we heard of the news in Parkland, Florida this week, and we heard that news unfold, that tragedy again and again, we sort of, after a while, we wanted to shut it off. Or if you had kids like I do, I wanted to shield them from it. I wanted to turn the news off as they woke up in the morning. And I think the cross is sort of like that. We have this aversion to the story of the cross, and rightfully so, because it's a violent story. It's a story that doesn't seem to gel really well with this graceful and peaceful God of ours. It's a dark story. But in order to get to Easter, we have to go through the cross. And so today we're going to read the story of the cross, just like we did on Wednesday, if you were here on Wednesday. Jesus has already had the Last Supper. Judas has already betrayed him. He's already been tried. And Pontius Pilate has had Jesus and this criminal Barabbas standing before all the people. And he said, "Which one do you want?" And they said, "Crucify that Jesus." And now we're going to pick up on this story the very next morning. It says it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him. I'm going to stop there because this is actually an important little detail in understanding the story. It said it was 9 o'clock in the morning when Jesus was crucified. In that Roman Empire, crosses were put up on major thoroughfares in major towns and villages all over the empire, at major intersections. So think of Nokomis and 3rd. And there they would crucify those who stepped out of line, those who challenged the authority of the empire. And it was there that they would crucify for all to see these who thought that they could one-up the empire. And so it's 9 o'clock in the morning. And that's an important detail because they intentionally did it in the morning so that everyone who was walking by on their way to the market, on their way to work all day long, would be able to see this Jesus on the cross, see him hanging there all alone. It says the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And as they put that sign up there, I imagine the soldiers laughing hysterically. What kind of a king is abandoned by his kingdom? It says, let's keep going. And with him they crucified 2 bandits, one on his left, or one on his right, and one on his left. Those who passed by, they derided him. They shake their heads, and they said, "Ah, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." In the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes, were also mocking him among themselves and saying, "He saved others, he cannot save himself. Let the Messiah, the King of Israel, come down from the cross now, so that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him, even they also taunted him. Everyone who passed by, from those who were just making their way to the market, to those who were the faith leaders of the day, to those who were those who were hanging on the cross on either side of him, they all mocked him. And there he hung, all alone. It says, when it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You see, Jesus there on the cross, he was utterly, totally abandoned. And I think it's there that Jesus' story and our story sort of intersect. Because although you and I, we probably wouldn't use the word abandon for what we've experienced in our life, because the word abandon seems to denote somebody who leaves a child at the door of a house. Or it seems to sort of, what comes to mind is a deadbeat dad who leaves his wife and kids and runs off somewhere. But I think each one of us have felt what it's like to be alone, to be forgotten, to feel as though we're not as important as others. And you see, I think it's on the cross that Jesus experiences that. It's Jesus' abandoned story. And I think each one of us have our own abandoned story. My abandoned story, I'll be vulnerable enough to share it. My abandoned story happened when I was in graduate school. I was there studying to be a pastor. There were some 300 other pastors, or would-be pastors, junior pastors, maybe you'd call us. Huh? And we were all studying to be pastors. And it was while I was there that I went home one evening, and I'll never forget that day in all my life. My wife at the time looked at me and said, I don't know that this marriage is working for me. And she and I would go on to have all kinds of counseling, and we would seek the support of all kinds of people we really cared about, but in the end, our marriage would end in a divorce. And I remember thinking as I was going through that, man, I'm really glad I'm at seminary. Because there are these 300 some other pastors who I know I can count on. Like, where would you rather be than surrounded by 300 pastors, right? But what turned out is that these other students that were studying to be pastors didn't quite know what to do with me. Because pastors aren't supposed to go through divorces. You see, that's my abandoned story. What's your abandoned story? Maybe for you, it was you raised your kids, and you did what we try and do as parents. We raised them to be independent. And then you sent them off into the world, and they actually were independent. They had their own lives, and they got busy with their own lives. And maybe you wouldn't say it this way, but maybe there was a little bit of you that felt a little abandoned when your kids left home. Or maybe for you, your abandoned story has to do with a job that ended or a career that ended. And when you realize that company you gave your entire life to, it went on without you, that you were replaced. Maybe you wouldn't say it out loud, but there's a little bit of you that felt abandoned. And students know what it's like to be abandoned. Abandoned when a teacher or a coach leaves for another crowd. A teacher or a coach, they find more potential in another student other than you. Or when a fellow student moves on from you to another crowd, you know what it's like to feel abandoned by a friend. I would even say carefully that I think our students today know what it's like to feel abandoned even by us parents. And I say this really carefully because I think so often we parents are so caught up in what our students' GPA, their ERA, their points per game, that subtly our students feel a little abandoned as well. Or maybe for you, it was when you lost a loved one, or maybe there were memory issues that set in for a loved one, or maybe you had a friend who turned their back on you. I think we all have our abandoned story. But here's the deal. Our abandoned stories are not the end of the story for God. They're not the end of the story for God. You see, Jesus' abandonment on the cross wasn't the end of the story for this God of ours. And if we were to keep reading the story, we find that crystal clear tonight. The story goes on like that. If you can read it, it says, Jesus was there on the cross, and he cried out. He said, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, help me here, my God, why have you forsaken me? A better translation of that is, my God, why have you abandoned me? When some of the bystanders heard it, they thought he had said Elijah, and they thought this prophet was going to come back. And so they said, listen, he's calling for Elijah. And someone ran and they filled a sponge with sour wine. They put it on a stick and they gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. Then Jesus let out a loud cry, and he breathed his last. Keep going. And here's where I want you to note. It says, and the curtain in the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Now when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. Way back when, in those ancient days, it was believed that God actually lived. God lived in the temple in Jerusalem. If you were here on Wednesday, we talked a little bit about this. It was believed that God lived in the temple in Jerusalem. The temple was shaped very similar to our church. There was this area way up front here that was called the Holy of Holies. And there in the Holy of Holies sat what was called the Ark of the Covenant. If you've seen Indiana Jones, think the Ark of the Covenant. It's this big gold ornate box that supposedly held the Ten Commandments, the tablets that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai. And it was believed that the Holy of Holies was the place where God actually lived. And if you were lucky enough to make it into the temple, if you were clean enough, if you were pure enough, if you were religious enough that you were allowed into the temple, you would have walked into the temple and seen right here, about right here, there would have been a big, tall curtain. And that curtain separated God's people from God. The temple represented a wall that the ancient people believed existed between them and God. Because it was believed that we in our humanity are unfit for the presence of God. That somehow God is too holy and too wonderful and too perfect to be in our presence. That we needed to be separated, us and our messy lives and our lives of pain and our lives of loss somehow needed to be separated from God. And so there was this temple, or this curtain. And you heard the story. The moment Jesus dies, that curtain that separated God's people from God, it came down. Because God didn't want to be known as a God separate from us amid all we face in our lives. God wanted to be known as one that is never apart from us, amid the pain, the loneliness, the abandonment we face from day to day. And if we read the story of the Bible, we hear this is a theme that comes up again and again and again. In the story of Moses, Moses is this little baby who's put down the river, basically abandoned. And God saw Moses, and he made sure that Moses grew up and would use Moses eventually to lead God's people to the promised land. If you know the story of Abraham and Sarah are in old age, and God doesn't forget them. God doesn't abandon them. God gives them a child. In fact, God gives them descendants as great as the stars. God doesn't abandon David. David, he's standing before the giant Goliath with his little slingshot. God gives him a handful of stones and a whole lot of courage to do what he needed to do. And in Jesus, God didn't abandon women like the woman at the well. God didn't abandon that questionable Zacchaeus, that sketchy tax collector. And in Jesus, God tells stories about people who drop everything to go after the one. The story of the lost coin, the story of the lost sheep. Again and again, this God wants to be known as one that will do anything. Anything to go after those of us that now and then feel alone or lost or abandoned. I read a story this week about written by a gentleman by the name of John Dominic Crossan. And he's a pretty well-known religious scholar. And he did a study on art way back in the 12th century. And he looked at the difference between pictures of the resurrection that were created in the Western church, and he compared those to pictures of the resurrection in the East, the way people depicted the resurrection in the Eastern Orthodox Church. And it's amazing to see the difference. I have a picture of each here. I want to put up one here. So this is a picture of how the church in the West in the 12th century depicted the resurrection of Jesus. If you look here, you see that Jesus is up in the sky. I think this is often how many of us picture the resurrection. And down below are all the people. And the picture is kind of hard to see for some of you in the back, but the people down below are not happy. But the picture is of Jesus ascending up into the sky. That's their image of the resurrection in the Western church. Now, if we flip to the next picture, this is a picture of how people in the Eastern church would depict in art the resurrection. And if you notice, Jesus has his arms out like this, right? And he's holding on to dear life to his people, for dear life to his people. The resurrection in the Eastern Orthodox Church isn't about a Jesus who somehow ascends up into the sky all by himself. But it's this idea that in the resurrection, Jesus held on for dear life to you and to me. Folks, as we journey through Lent, we have this cross in the front. And I hope and pray that as you see this cross, maybe it would speak to you as we move through this time of Lent. And that as you see it, maybe it would just remind you that whatever abandonment you might feel, whatever loneliness you might have felt in your life, we have a God who promises that nothing will ever separate us from this God. That if we are ever feeling forsaken by God, abandoned by God, we are mistaken. I'm going to actually invite Nolan to come over to the piano here. Over the last couple of weeks, I found a song. It's entitled "The Cross Forever Speaks." And I think it speaks well to our theme during this season of Lent. The first few words go like this: though I'm hemmed in on each side sometimes in life, I am never abandoned. Though God's ways are not always my ways, I know I'm not forsaken. And as the song goes on, it says, because the cross forever speaks.